Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Think I've got confirmation that we are up. Let's see. This is going on. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Halloween Stream Time. I hope you're seeing this. I hope you're hearing this. We'll see how this goes.
Halloween from Channel 13.
Because the following holiday specials, The Incredible Hulk, will not be presented this evening.
So, how did you prepare for your role in Teen Wolf 2? Did you hang out with werewolves?
Well, I wanted to, but, they're very private people, Alan. They think everybody hates them just because a few nights a month they turn into vicious, killing creatures. So I kind of had to make it up as I go, as I went along.
I guess you
tough.
did. It's kind of one of those ad-lib parts,
Yeah, kind of like what we're doing now.
And that's good.
Yeah.
This is not a Bob Hope special. What was the movie like? What's it about?
It was, it's about this kid who goes to college to study science, but they want him to box because they think he's going to be a good werewolf boxer, and, well, he happens to be, and it's a story of success and what success can do to a person. It's much like the first one in that sense, but it's very funny.
And it's very hairy, too.
It's a hairy pit.
We're going to see a clip here. Could you set this one up for us?
Yeah, my pleasure. This is the first time, I believe, in the film where Todd, my character, is turned into the wolf, and they're at a tea party for the new students to meet everybody.
What fun.
Yeah, here we go.
Sorry, everyone. I'm checking my stream situation. Doesn't seem to be going up to Facebook for some reason. What are the problems here? Hold tight. Maybe I'll just have to plant it from YouTube instead. Woo! Okay. Well, it's working on YouTube. Not working on Facebook for some reason. All right. Let's go. Let's get back to it.
Ed Johnson of the New York News wrote, "At long last, I have seen a horror show even scarier than advertised. A horror show strictly in a class by itself. If it's thrills you want, thrills you'll get, when you see Dr. Satan's Shriek in the Night. It's brand new. It's brand new. Positively has never been shown at this theater before. Don't miss Dr. Satan's Shriek in the Night. Plus, a great...
Monsters do have their place. In the zoo, in your nightmares, in the deep, in your favorite horror movies. But not in your living room, on your TV. Don't let pay TV be the monster in your living room. Pay TV and cable TV companies are seeking the right to charge you for the very programs you now get free. If you want to stop pay TV and save free television, sign the petition in the lobby of this theater. Let your lawmakers know how you feel in the fight against pay TV and cable TV.
Right, okay. There. Now, don't that look just like Rick Ocasek from the Cars? Okay, now it's time to carve those features. Now, choose your cutting instrument wisely. Lots of folks like to use the traditional butcher knife for this part, but I prefer this. A chainsaw. A thing of beauty, just like me.
Haha! Hey, everybody. Sorry about that. I really apologize. I got flustered by the fact that the stream's not working on Facebook and forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Nick Woodward, for mentioning the fact that you lost my audio. Damn it. I'm going to edit the bejesus out of this after the fact. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start us off nice and easy with a couple pages out of Stephen King's It. And then I'm going to do a little video snippet and come back with one of my buddy Nick Woodward's horror movie reviews, also with a little video. If the video is appropriately small enough in a little window so that I don't get booted off of YouTube for using it. Oh boy. So let me just do this to get warmed up. And let me recheck my Facebook stream one more time. Nope, not a damn thing. All right, well, there's some disconnect between Restream. It says it's been sending the data for the last 10 minutes. So, don't know what else to do. Here we go. This is from Stephen King's It. From May 1985. Now they were coming again, and while everything had gone, much as it had foreseen, something it had not foreseen had returned. That maddening, galling fear. That sense of another. It hated the fear, would have turned on it and eaten it if it could have. But the fear danced mockingly out of reach, and it could only kill the fear by killing them. Surely there was no need for such fear. They were older now, and their number had been reduced from 7 to 5. 5 was a number of power, but it did not have the mystical, talismanic quality of 7. It was true, but it did not have to... It was true that its dog's body hadn't been able to kill the librarian, but the librarian would die in the hospital. Later, just before dawn touched the sky, it would send a male nurse with a bad pill habit to finish the librarian once and for all. The writer's woman was now with it, alive yet not alive. Her mind had been utterly destroyed by her first sight of it as it really was, with all of its little masks and glamours thrown aside. And all the glamours were only mirrors, of course. Throwing back at the terrified viewer the worst thing in his or her own mind. Heliographing images as a mirror may bounce a reflection of the sun into a wide, unsuspecting eye and stun it to blindness. Now, the mind of the writer's wife was with it, in it, beyond the end of the macroverse, in the darkness beyond the turtle, in the outlands beyond all lands. She was in its eye. She was in its mind. She was in the deadlights. Oh, but the glamours were amusing. Hanlon, for instance, he would not remember, not consciously, but his mother could have told him where the bird he had seen at the ironworks came from. When he was a baby, only 6 months old, his mother had left him sleeping in his cradle in the side yard while she went around back to hang sheets and diapers on the line. His screams had brought her on the run. A large crow had lighted on the edge of the carriage and was pecking at baby Mikey like an evil creature in a nursery tale. He had been screaming in pain and terror, unable to drive away the crow, which had sensed weak prey. She had struck the bird with her fist and driven it off, seen that it had brought blood in 2 or 3 places on baby Mikey's arms, and taken him to Dr. Stillwagon for a tetanus shot. A part of Mike had remembered that always. Tiny baby, giant bird. And when it came to Mike had seen the giant bird again. Meaning when it came to Mike. But when the dog's body husband of the girl from before brought the writer's woman, it had put on no face. It did not dress when it was at home. The dog's body husband had looked once and had dropped dead of shock, his face gray, his eyes filling with the blood that had squirted out of his brain in a dozen places. The writer's woman had put out one powerful, horrified thought. Oh, dear Jesus, it is female. And then all thoughts ceased. She swam in the deadlights. It came down from its place and took care of her physical remains, prepared them for later feeding. Now Audra Denbrough hung high, up in the middle of things, crisscrossed in silk, her head lolling against the socket of her shoulder, her eyes wide and glazed, her toes pointing down. But there was still power in them, diminished but still there. They had come here as children, and somehow, against all the odds, against all that was supposed to be and all that could be, they had hurt it badly, had almost killed it, had forced it to flee deep into the earth, where it huddled, hurt and hating and trembling in a spreading pool of its own strange blood. So another new thing, if you please, for the first time in its never-ending history, it needed to make a plan. For the first time, it found itself afraid simply to take what it wanted from dairy, its private game preserve. It had always fed well on children. Many adults could be used without knowing that they had been used, and it had even fed on a few of the older ones over the years. Adults had their own terrors, and their glands could be tapped, opened so that all the chemicals of fear flooded the body and salted the meat. But their fears were mostly too complex. The fears of children were simpler and usually more powerful. The fears of children could often be summoned up in a single face. And if bait were needed, why, what child did not love a clown? It understood vaguely that these children had somehow turned its own tools against it, that by coincidence, surely not on purpose, surely not guided by the hand of any other, by the bonding of 7 extraordinarily imaginative minds, it had been brought into a zone of great danger. Any of these 7 alone would have been its meat and drink. And if they had not happened to come together, it surely would have picked them off one by one, drawn by the quality of their minds, just as a lion might be drawn to one particular waterhole by the scent of zebra. But together they had discovered an alarming secret that even it had not been aware of. That belief has a second edge. If there are 10,000 medieval peasants who create vampires by believing them real, there may be one, probably a child, who will imagine the stake necessary to kill it. But a stake is only stupid wood. The mind is the mallet which drives it home. Yet in the end, it had escaped, had gone deep, and the exhausted, terrified children had elected not to follow it when it was at its most vulnerable. They had elected to believe it dead or dying and had retreated. It was aware of their oath and had known they would come back just as a lion knows the zebra will eventually return to the waterhole. It had begun to plan even as it began to drowse. When it woke, it would be healed, renewed, but their childhoods would be burned away like 7 fatty candles. The former power of their imaginations would be muted and weak. They would no longer imagine that there were piranha in the Kandeskiag, or that if you stepped on a crack, you might really break your mother's back, or that if you killed a ladybug which lit on your shirt, your house would catch fire that night. Instead, they would believe in insurance. Instead, they would believe in wine with dinner, something nice, but not too pretentious, like a Poulet Fusset 83, and let that breathe, waiter, would you? Instead, they would believe that Rolaids consume 47 times their own weight in excess stomach acid. Instead, they would believe in public television, Gary Hart running to prevent heart attacks, giving up red meat to prevent colon cancer. They would believe in Dr. Ruth when it came to getting well fucked, and Jerry Falwell when it came to getting well saved. And each year, as it passed, their dreams would get smaller. And when it woke, it would call them back. Yes, back, because fear was fertile. Its child was rage, and rage cried for revenge. It would call them and then kill them. Only now that they were coming, the fear had returned. They had grown up, and their imaginations had weakened, but not as much as it had believed. It had felt an ominous, upsetting growth in their power when they joined together, and it had wondered for the first time if it had perhaps made a mistake. But why be gloomy? The die was cast, and not all the omens were bad. The writer was half mad for his wife, and that was good. The writer was the strongest, the one who had somehow trained his mind for this confrontation over all the years. And when the writer was dead, with his guts falling out of his body, when their precious Big Bill was dead, the others would be its quickly. It would feed well, and then perhaps it would go deep again and doze for a while.
We'll find a way.
It's Miss Halloween of 1976.
You held a beauty contest and had a winner?
And here she is, Miss Halloween. You may rise. You're Paul?
Oh, not necessarily.
But you promised me a date with Paul Newman.
Well, I've been told there is a striking resemblance right around the chin.
Yes. Well, we can remove that with a little lotion, dear. If If you couldn't get Paul Newman, why didn't you get some other famous Paul? Paul Williams, or Paul McCartney, Les Paul, Paul Moll, St. Paul. Why, Paul Lynde? He was available. I'm afraid he just won't do.
I won't do what? What's she got in mind?
When I won the contest, I won a date with Paul Newman. I won first prize, not booby prize. Goodbye, booby. I've got a cauldron at home on low bubble. We'll meet again, Mr. Lynde, when you're somebody.
She has a striking resemblance to Betty White. But then so many witches do.
Okay, back now. So let's turn off that. Let's turn on this. Ha ha ha. All right. Now, if this is going to work, I'm going to go into a horror movie pick of the day. Movie review by Nick Woodward. This is My Bloody Valentine from 1981, directed by George Mihalka, starring Paul Kellman, Laurie Hallier, Neil Affleck, Don Franks, Keith Wright, Alf Humphreys, and Larry Reynolds. Close to 11 o'clock at night, on Monday, December the 8th, 1980, musician John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono were walking into their apartment building in New York City when Mark David Chapman emerged from the shadows and fired 4 hollow point rounds into Lennon's back. John Lennon, the founding member of the Beatles and one of the most widely influential musical artists of the last 100 years, died on the steps of the Dakota apartment that night. The world was shocked and struggled to find answers. In grief, conservative groups and authorities lashed out at violence in media, and in particular, horror films. Studios and the MPAA took action. And perhaps the most victimized of these horror films released in the wake of Lennon's murder was George Mihalka's 1981 slasher film, My Bloody Valentine. The Canadian mining town of Valentine's Bluff is preparing to throw its first Valentine's Day dance in 20 years. 20 years prior, 2 mining supervisors eager to join the town celebration left their post monitoring methane levels in the mine below. An explosion occurred and 5 miners were buried alive. Several weeks later, when rescuers were able to dig through the debris, they found only Harry Warden alive, having survived by feeding on the bodies of his fellow miners trapped below. Driven insane and tormented by the thought of being buried alive while members of the town partied at the Valentine's Day dance, Harry Warden, dressed in full mining gear, and sought revenge 1 year later by carving out the hearts of the 2 supervisors responsible for the explosion with his pickaxe. Just watching the replay, making sure might have to rewind this. Let's see. Harry stuffed their bloody hearts in heart-shaped candy boxes and issued the warning within to never hold another Valentine's Day dance ever again. With 2 decades past and the memory of Harry Warden treated as an urban legend, the townspeople and young miners that's MINORS, of Valentine's Bluff are ready to celebrate on the Day of Lovers once again. TJ, the town mayor's son. Ooh, let's start over. Didn't buy myself enough time. Yoink. TJ, the town mayor's son, having recently returned to Valentine's Bluff and the mines, finds his girlfriend, Sarah, had begun dating his friend, Axel. Meanwhile, Mayor Haniger receives a heart-shaped box containing a blood-soaked human heart and a reminder to heed the warning of Harry Morgan. A killer dressed in full mining gear begins dispatching victims, and the town cancels the dance. Still hoping to party, the young miners and their girls descend into the mine, with the killer lurking behind. Chief Newby follows the killer's trail, trying to uncover if Harry Warden has returned or if someone new has picked up the pickaxe to carry out Warden's bloody promise. In the wake of the backlash to violence in Friday the 13th from 1980 and the murder of John Lennon, the MPAA went to town on My Bloody Valentine when it was submitted for classification. Cut after cut was demanded, removing violence and gore from nearly every death sequence in the film, and the film was given an X rating. Still, Finally, the butchers at the MPAA were satisfied when nearly 9 minutes of the film were removed and the theatrical cut was whittled down to a mere 90 minutes. Paramount Pictures, having released Friday the 13th and being on the receiving end of much of the backlash, was happy to comply, but director Mihalka was not. Feeling his film was ripped to shreds and blamed for real-life violence it wasn't even around to inspire, George Mihalka was less than thrilled with the final product. My Bloody Valentine was a rough film to shoot. Filmed in the mines of Nova Scotia, Canada, and backed in part by Canadian tax dollars raised through the Canadian Film Development Corporation, the shoot faced several challenges, this including considerable obstacles in lighting the mines, as only specialty lights could be used, and in limited quantities to avoid upsetting the methane levels within the mine. The mine used for the shoot had been closed in 1975, but the owners, upon hearing a major motion picture was going to be filmed there, spent thousands of dollars cleaning it up. Much to the dismay of the production, thousands of dollars had to be spent on their end to return the mine to its former condition, one more suitable for shooting a horror film. My Bloody Valentine was made in the wake of the first wave of slasher films, due in part to the genre-defining Halloween released in 1978. It became standard to center slasher films around holidays. There was Prom Night, 1980, Graduation Day, 81, Silent Night, Deadly Night, 84, and April Fool's Day in 1986, to name just a few. Given the relatively low budget and quick production time of the slasher films, the producers feared somebody might beat them to the punch with a Valentine's Day-themed horror film if they learned of the film's production. Out of precaution, the film was made under the false title, The Secret. During production, none of the actors were told who the killer was, in hopes of making all their performances as genuine as possible, with no hints of the killer's true identity coming through in their performance. Sadly, the secret may have been ruined when one actor, who shall not be named to avoid spoilers, was asked to have a cast made of his arm for a dismemberment sequence, a particular injury that the killer suffers late in the film. Also, to be expected, My Bloody Valentine was not received well upon release, but was a moderate financial success for Paramount Pictures. Although it failed to replicate the success of Friday the 13th, and as a result, no sequel was ever made. Although, Mihalka did pitch them a sequel concept in 2001. Affleck went on to become an animator, working on several popular animated properties, including The Simpsons and Family Guy. As the appreciation for cult films and horror cinema has grown in the decades that followed, My Bloody Valentine has gained a cult following, received reevaluation from critics, and has been named as the all-time favorite slasher film of Quentin Tarantino. All this eventually led to a small movement for the original uncut version of the film to be dug out of the mines of Paramount. It started when Paramount released My Bloody Valentine on DVD in 2002. The disc only contained the theatrical cut of the film, and Paramount insisted all the excised footage had been lost or destroyed. Later in 2009, as Lionsgate prepared their shoddy and unnecessary 3D remake, they also licensed the original film for a DVD release. The good news for fans of the film and the slasher genre in general was that Lionsgate had unearthed a new print of the film with 3 minutes of footage recovered. This found footage restored almost all the violence and gore removed from the film. Mihalka, who approved the new transfer and cut, confirmed the film was now 80 to 85% complete, right? Because it's still a missing 6 minutes somewhere. He later clarified that most of the still missing 6 minutes, was of exposition and dialogue that served little to the plot of the film. However, he does maintain the brutal impalement of Mike and Harriet, played by Alf Humphreys and Terry Waterland, while having sex with a large mining auger. I mean, the impalement with a large mining auger, not them having sex with a large mining auger. Made famous by production photos in Fangoria magazine, was filmed. To date, though the footage has never been found and is thought to be destroyed. Only the brutal aftermath of this kill remains in the final uncut version of the film. Sadly, even horror film distribution giants Scream Factory were not able to supply any additional footage when they released their 2-disc special edition Blu-ray in 2020. However, the newly remastered 2K scans from Scream Factory's release of the original camera negatives for both theatrical and uncut version are the definitive way to watch the film. If there is one added benefit to holiday-themed horror films, it's their resilience past the month of October and the Halloween holiday. Christmas is jam-packed with horror films, surprisingly having even more than Halloween does. But Valentine's Day is low on terror. My Bloody Valentine makes for a great film to watch with one significant other on the most romantic day of the year. Of course, the likelihood of getting lucky made it go down, depending upon the cinematic tastes of the ones we love. That was Nick Woodward. Thank you very much, Nick, for giving me fun stuff to read from during this. All right. Let us now remove that winder, and let me get ready to read you some old stuff.
Hello, Alan. He really did a good job, didn't he? They love you out there in the hallway. They love you. The mummies.
The whole crew of them. Look at them all.
They think you're a great VJ, and they told me to tell you that they thought you should continue to be one.
Yeah? Okay, well, we will continue with the Halloween countdown. Videos from Mr. Pink Floyd, Belinda Carlisle. Alan, I know you got to go. Thank you very much for coming.
No, I don't have to go anywhere.
Yeah, Alan's got to catch a plane, everybody. Let's hear it for him,
What plane? I'm here. I got all the time in the world tonight. Hey!
See ya. Bye-bye.
Hey, Jason, man, come on.
We'll be right back, so don't go away unless something is dragging you away.
He's a concerned citizen, a true romantic, and has a taste for fine literature. And now Snoopy's packing up and hitting the road.
You say he got this letter, and then he just took off? Maybe Snoopy felt he needed a vacation.
What should Charlie Brown do?
I think you should disown that ungrateful dog. Disown him?
It's the whole Peanuts gang in the full-length feature.
Snoopy, come home!
November on...
This is going to get tricky. I'm going to read from Werewolf by Montague Summers. This is a historical record of every recorded werewolf encounter, sighting, etc. It was printed originally, I think, 1933. Yeah. And it's a bit rough to read because it's oldie Englishy style. So bear with me. Also, not just that it's oldie Englishy style. Also, it is, it uses a lot of, a Kerbillion sort of ethnic terms, and the pronunciations are going to be weird for me on some of these. So here we go. Let's try Chapter 6. The North, Russia, and Germany. So immense is the wealth of tradition concerning shape-shifting contained in the ancient sagas of the North that it becomes difficult in a strictly limited space even to indicate some of the better known and most striking of these histories, whose legendary lore, if it is all adequately to be examined, demands a concentrated study of no inconsiderable extension. In Norway and Iceland, those men who could assume another shape were said to be Eigi Einhamir, or not of one form. Again, I'm apologizing in advance for any Norse people watching or listening to this, as I butcher all these words. There's a lot of them. The adopted shape was called by the same name as the original shape, Hamir. And the process of transformation they called Skipta Humum, or At Hamaz. Hamrimi signifies the supernatural strength thus acquired. The going about in that form was Hamfur or Hamfarir. A man who thus became possessed of more than human might was Hamramr. The man who traveled with surpassing speed, therefore, was Hamhlepa. The man borrowed the animal, with whose force he was invigorated, with whose fleetness he was endowed. He follows the instincts of the beast, whose body he has made his own, but his own intelligence is neither clouded nor snuffed. The soul remains unchanged, and hence the mirror of the soul, the eye, can by no art be altered. Frigg and Freyja had their Valshamar, or falcon mantles, attired in which they could cleave the air with the swiftness and surety of that bird. Loki, the tale went, donned one of these, and so exactly resembled a falcon that none could have discovered him save for the malicious glint of his eyes. The name for a wolf shirt, which effected the metamorphosis to a wolf, was Ulfhamir, and the werewolf himself was commonly known as Vargir. In modern Scandinavia, the term is Varulf, which has been extended to include the shape-shifting to a bear. For all the Hamramir, none were more famous than the Berserkir, or Berserker, the Bear Sark men. 12 berserkers were the chief followers of several kings of old, and, for example, the Danish king Rolf Krake, King Adils, and Harald Harfagri. Harfagri. In battle, the berserkers were subject to fits of frenzy, furor bersericus, termed berserksgangre, or gangre, maybe that's what it is, with an R at the end after a G. Berserksgangre, when they howled like wild beasts, foamed at the mouth, and bit through the iron rim of their shields. During these fits, they were, according to popular belief, proof against steel and fire, and made terrible havoc in the ranks of the foe. When the fever abated, they were weak and tame. In the Islandia Jus Ecclesiastica, the Berserksgangre is regarded as diabolic possession and can only be cured by religious vows. My love for you is like a truck berserker. William of Auvergne, Auvergne. Sorry, getting messages. Just trying to avoid people jumping on the wrong link. Bishop of Paris, in his De Universo 2, Pars 3, tells the story of a bear in Saxony who carried off a soldier's wife and kept her for years in a cave and knew her so that she bore him children. And when she escaped, these children accompanied her in her flight. They lived for many years and were exceedingly fierce and good soldiers. They had bear in their faces and were called Ursini from Ursus, their sire. Bishop William says that, cover the children's ears. Bishop William says that the semen Ursinum so resembles the semen humanum that a child may be born of a woman. In his Bekehrung der Norwegischen Stammes zum Christentum, Konrad Maurer relates his history of Ulfr Bjalfason, the evening wolf from Eigla. Folk said that Ulfr was much given to shifting his shape, Hamramr. And when he was called Kveldufr, evening wolf. Oh, and he was called evening wolf. When the werewolf fit came over him and his companions, their exploits were bloody with the most ferocious savagery. Whilst the passion endured, none could withstand their might. But once it had passed, they were weak as water for a while. Here it should be remarked that the Norwegian berserker were often none other than the professional gangs of marauding Mohawks who roamed that's Mohocks, not the American spelling, obviously, who roamed the countryside, plundering and terrorizing wherever they went. It was their wont that some bully of gigantic strength among them could challenge a landowner to holmgang, the duello. And if the berserk conquered, he would carry off his dead opponent's wife and the daughters, extorting ransom or possessing himself of the property entire. Often the Titan brigand is slain by the gallant Icelandic hero. Famous among ancient Norse stories is the legend of Sigmund the Volsung and his son Sinfjotli. It so befell that on a day in the summertide these twain went forth through the forest, seeking spoil. And they lighted upon a certain house in which were two men, with great gold rings deeply fallen upon sleep. These were two king's sons, spellbound skin changers, and above them on the wall hung two wolf shirts. Now it was the 10th day, and on that day alone they were released from the spell, and might come out of the skins. Sigmund and Sinfjotli don the shirts, but can by no means put them off, for upon them the ensorcelment had taken hold. And the weird of the king's sons must they dree, for they howled as wolves, and they understood one another as afore, when they had spoken in the voice of men. So they go forth into the forest depths, adventuring, and slay many, being full weary after the slaughter. At the last they repair to the hidden house, and on the 10th day they doff the wolf shirts, burning this gear in the fire. Another story in the Volsunga saga tells how an old bitch wolf, huge and grim, came out of the forest, and night after night ate a man alive. This wolfen, it was thought, was the mother of King Siggeir, or Siggeir, E-I-R. And she had shifted her shape by trolls' lore and devilry. To come to a later day, Arvad August Afzelius, in his Svenska Folkvisor från Forntiden, has an important note upon the Varulf eller Man-Ulf, and also relates that a Swedish soldier from Kalmar during the last war with Russia in 1808 to 1809 was homesick and came back in the shape of a wolf. Unluckily, he was shot by a hunter just outside his native village. So, morality tale, I guess. Don't go MIA. Don't bail on your appointed duties in the army, I suppose. Unluckily, he was shot by a hunter just outside his native village. When the dead wolf, a huge beast, was skinned, a man's shirt was found next to the body. A woman identified it as one she had stitched for her husband before he left for the field. Olaus Magnus, in his Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus, Rome, 1555, has much to say of wolves in general, and devotes the last 3 chapters of his 18th book to werewolfery, emphasizing the hellish ferocity of the werewolf and discussing these transformations with examples of such metamorphosis, both from old days and in his own time. In the feast of Christ's nativity, in the night, at a certain place that they are resolved upon among themselves, there is gathered together such a multitude of wolves changed from men that dwell in divers places, which afterwards the same night doth so rage with wonderful fierceness, both against mankind and other creatures, that are not fierce by nature, that the inhabitants of that country suffer more hurt from them than they ever do from true natural wolves. For as it is proved, they set upon the houses of men that are in the woods with wonderful fierceness, and labor to break down the doors, whereby they may destroy both men and other creatures that remain there. They go into beer cellars, and there they drink out some tons of beer, TUNS, or mead, wherein they differ from natural and true wolves. Between Lithuania, Samogatia, and Curonia, there is a certain wall left of a castle that was thrown down. To this, at a set time, some thousands of them come together, that each of them may try his nimbleness in leaping. He that cannot leap over this wall, as commonly the fat ones cannot, are beaten with whips by their captains, and it is constantly affirmed that among the multitude are the great men and chiefest nobility of the land. Olaus Magnus relates how when a certain nobleman was traveling through the woods, who had many servile country fellows in his company that were acquainted with this witchcraft of shapeshifting, and they were not only benighted, but withal sore pinched with hunger and want, when a flock of sheep was spied at a distance, one of the company promised they should have a lamb to roast for supper. Presently he goes into a thicket so that no man might see him, and then he changed his human shape like to a wolf. After this he fell upon the flock with all his might, and in the form of a wolf brought back a sheep to the chariot. His companions, being conscious how he stole it, receive it with grateful mind, and hide it close in the chariot. But he that had changed himself into a wolf went into the wood again, and became a man. Also in Livonia, not many years since, continues our author, It fell out that the wife of a great lord openly said that men could not be turned into wolves, whereupon one of the servants standing by declared that he would presently show her an example of that business, so that he might do it with her permission. He goes alone into the cellar, and anon he comes out in the form of a wolf. The dogs ran after him through the fields to the wood, and they bit out one of his eyes, though he defended himself stoutly enough. The next day he came with one eye to his lady. It is fresh in memory how the Duke of Prussia, giving small credit to such a witchcraft, compelled one who was cunning in this sorcery, whom he held in chains, to change himself into a wolf, and he did so. Yet that he might not go unpunished for his idolatry, he afterwards caused him to be burnt. For such heinous offenses are severely punished by both divine and human laws.
Speedy McGreedy have created Frankenstein Mouth.
I want juicy burgers.
We'll go to Hardee's.
The burgers are juicy at Hardee's.
Right, Ivan. Hardee's job Royalson.
Let's say hello to Hardee's.
It's Halloween time. When you buy a burger and soft drink at Hardee's, you get a coin to put in the fun machine, which gives you a Halloween prize.
I got a creepy crawly Halloween thing. I got a Halloween ring.
The fun machine at participating Hardee's.
Hello, you rotten little bloodsuckers. Alice Cooper here. Welcome to my nightmare. Welcome to my house, and welcome to a truly shocking Halloween edition of Headbangers Ball. Tonight I'll be playing chilling videos from masters of metal like Ozzy Osbourne, Motley Crue, Danzig, and Dokken, to name a few, maybe even a few of my own videos. Stopping by on this night of trick-or-treat, where I have everything to give them, are some bands who'll appear in the Shocker soundtrack album. Dave Mustaine from Megadeth, the guys from Dangerous Toys, and of course, Iggy Pop. And best of all, we'll meet the lucky winner of MTV's Shock Treatment Contest. This will be a Hallows Eve to end all Hallows Eve. And what better place to start it all off than a haunted castle in Great Britain with Black Sabbath.
Evening, Igor.
Coming back in a sec.
If you want a better orange soda, made with more natural orange flavor than ever before,
is that Tom
try
Bosley?
Shasta. It's got the bright color, the sweet smell, and the great taste of
Tom
oranges. Shasta. It's the orange soda that can make anybody happy.
Rightio. Oof. Needed a break. All right, I'm going to go back to Stephen King's It for a bit. We'll cut to videos, and then I'm going to come into some old school stuff with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This is Derry, the fourth interlude, starting with a quote from John Lee Hooker. You got to lose. Can't win all the time. You got to lose. You can't win all the time, baby. What I say? I know, pretty baby. I see trouble coming down the line. April 6th, 1985. Tell you what, friends and neighbors, I'm drunk tonight. Fuck drunk. Rye whiskey. Went down to Wally's and got started. Went to the Green Front down on Center Street half an hour before they closed and bought a fifth of rye. I know what I'm up to. Drink cheap tonight, pay dear tomorrow. So here he sits. One drunk N-word. Mike Hanlon is a African-American gentleman. I'm going to censor him because this is on YouTube and heaven only knows what'll happen. So here he sits, one drunk N-word in the public library after closing, with his book open in front of me, and a bottle of Old Kentucky on my left. Tell the truth and shame the devil, my mom used to say, but she forgot to tell me that sometimes you can't shame Mr. Splitfoot sober. The Irish know, but of course they're God's white N-words, and who knows, maybe they're a step ahead. Want to write about drinking the devil? Remember Treasure Island? The old sea dog of the Admiral Benbow. We'll do him yet, Jackie. I bet the bitter old fuck even believed it. Full of rum or rye. You can believe anything. Drink and the devil. Okay. Amuses me sometimes to think how long I'd last if I actually published some of the stuff I write in the dead of night. If I flashed some of the skeletons in Derry's closet. There is a library board of directors, 11 of them. One is a 70-year-old writer who suffered a stroke 2 years ago and who now often needs help to find his place on each meeting's printed agenda, and who has sometimes been observed picking large, dry boogers out of his hairy nostrils and placing them carefully in his ear, as if for safekeeping. Another is a pushy woman who came here from New York with her doctor husband, who talks in a constant whiny monologue about how provincial Derry is, and how no one here understands the Jewish experience, and how one has to go to Boston to buy a skirt one would care to be seen in. Last time this anorexic babe spoke to me without the services of an intermediary was during the board's Christmas party about a year and a half ago. She had consumed a pretty large amount of gin and asked me if anyone in Derry understood the black experience. I had also consumed a pretty large amount of gin and answered, Mrs. Gladry, Jews may be a great mystery, but N-words are understood the whole world round. She choked on her drink, turned around so sharply that her panties were momentarily visible under her flaring skirt. Not a very interesting view. Would that it had been Carol Danner. And so ended my last informal conversation with Mrs. Ruth Gladry. No great loss. The other members of the board are the descendants of the lumber barons. Their support of the library is an act of inherited expiation. They raped the woods and now care for these books the way a libertine might decide in his middle age to provide for the gaily gotten bastards of his youth. It was their grandfathers and great-grandfathers who actually spread the legs of the forests north of Derry and Bangor and raped those green-gowned virgins with their axes and peaveys. They cut and slashed and strip-timbered and never looked back. They tore the hymen of those great forests open when Grover Cleveland was president and had pretty well finished the job by the time Woodrow Wilson had had his stroke. These lace-ruffled ruffians raped the great woods, impregnated them with a litter of slash and junk spruce, and changed Derry from a sleepy little shipbuilding town into a booming honky-tonk where the gin mills never closed and the whores turned tricks all night long. One old campaigner, Egbert Thorogood, now 93, told me of taking a slat-thin prostitute in a crib in Baker Street, a street which no longer exists, middle-class apartments housing, stands quietly where Baker Street once boiled and brawled. I only realized after I spent my spunk in her that she was laying in a pool of jism maybe an inch deep. Stuff had just about gone to jelly. Girl, I says, ain't you never cared for yourself? She looks down and says, I'll put a new sheet on if you want to go again. There's 2 in the cupboard down the hall, I think. I knows pretty much what I'm laying in until 9 or 10, but by midnight, my cunt's so numb, it might's well be an Ellsworth. Yeah, this is not a rated G Halloween reading, by the way, at 7 o'clock on a Friday. So what was Derry right through the first 20 or so? I mean, I assume saying I'm about to read from Stephen King's It would be the clue. Right through the first 20 or so years of the 20th century, all boom and booze and bawling. The Penobscot and the Kenduskeag were full of floating logs, from ice out in April to ice in November. The business began to slack off in the 20s without the Great War or the hardwoods to feed it, and it staggered to a stop during the Depression. The lumber barons put their money in those New York or Boston banks that had survived the crash and left Derry's economy to live or die on its own. They retreated to their gracious houses on West Broadway and sent their children to private schools in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and New York, and lived on their interest and political connections. Stephen King did not write Massachusetts. That was me by way of Bugs Bunny. What's left of their supremacy, some 70-some years after Egbert Thorogood spent his love with a dollar whore in a spermy Baker Street bed, are empty wildwoods in Penobscot and Aroostook counties, and the great Victorian houses which stand for 2 blocks along West Broadway, and my library, of course. Except those good folks from West Broadway would take my library away from me in jig time. Pun definitely intended. If I published anything about the Legion of Decency, the fire at the Black Spot, the execution of the Bradley Gang, or the affair of Claude Heroux and the Silver Dollar. The Silver Dollar was a beer joint, and what may have been the queerest mass murder in the entire history of America took place there in September of 1905. There are still a few old-timers in Derry who claim to remember it, but the only account that I really trust is Thorogood's. He was 18 when it happened. Thorogood now lives in the Paulson nursing home. He's toothless, and his St. John's Valley Franco/Down East accent is so thick that probably only another Mainer could understand what he was saying if his talk were written down phonetically. Sandy Ives, the folklorist from the University of Maine, whom I have mentioned previously in these wild pages, helped me to translate my audio tapes. Claude Heroux was, according to Thorogood, un backcanic son of a whore with an eye that'd roll at you like a martz in the moonlight. Translation: one bad Canuck son of a whore with an eye that would roll at you like a mare's in the moonlight. Thorogood said that he and everyone else who had worked with Heroux believed that man was as sly as a chicken-stealing dog, which made his hatchet-wielding foray into the Silver Dollar all the more startling. It was not in his character. Up until then, the lumbermen of Derry had believed Heroux's talents ran to more to lighting fires in the woods. Summer of 1905 was long and hot, and there had been many fires in the woods. The biggest of them, which Heroux later admitted he set by simply putting a lighted candle in the middle of a pile of wood chips and kindling, happened in Haven's Big Injun Woods. It burned 20,000 acres of prime hardwood, and you could smell the smoke of it 30 miles away as the horse-drawn trolleys breasted up Mile Hill in Derry. In the spring of that year, there had been some brief talk about unionizing. There were 4 lumbermen involved in organizing. Not that there was much to organize. Maine working men were anti-union then and are mostly anti-union now. And one of the 4 was Claude Heroux, who probably saw his union activities as a chance to talk big and spend a lot of time drinking down on Baker and Exchange Streets. Heroux and the other 3 called themselves organizers. The lumber barons called them ringleaders. A proclamation nailed to the cook sheds and lumber camps from Monroe to Haven Village to Sumner Plantation to Millinocket informed lumbermen that any man overheard talking union would be fired from the job immediately. In May of that year, there was a brief strike up near Trapham Notch. And although the strike was broken in short order, both by scabs and by town constables, see something here. Let me expand a bit. That was a rather peculiar you understand, since there were nearly 30 town constables swinging axe handles and creasing skulls. But before that day in May, there hadn't been so much as a single constable in Trapham Notch, which had a population of 79 in the census of 1900, so far as anyone knew. Heru and his organizing friends considered it a great victory for their cause. Accordingly, they came down to Derry to get drunk and to do some more organizing or ringleading, depending on whose side you favored. Whichever, it must have been dry work. They hit most of the bars in Hell's Half Acre, finishing up the sleepy silver dollar, arms around each other's shoulders, pissing down your leg drunk, alternating Union songs with pathetic tunes like My Mother's Eyes Are Looking Down from Heaven. Although I myself think that any mother looking down from there and seeing her son in such a state might well have been excused for turning away. According to Egbert Thorogood, the only reason anyone could figure for Hero's being in the movement at all was Davy Hartwell. Hartwell was the chief organizer or ringleader, and Heru was in love with him. Nor was he the only one. Most of the men in the movement loved Hartwell deeply and passionately, with the proud love men save for those of their own sex, who possess a magnetism that seems to approach divinity. Davy Hartwell, what I mean, who walk like he on half of the world, and Adam Adalia on the rest. Thorogood said. Translation, Davy Hartwell was a man who walked like he owned half the world and had him a deadlock on the rest. Heru followed Hartwell into the organizing business the way he would have followed him if he had decided to go for a shipbuilder up in Brewer or down in Bath, or building the Seven Trestles over in Vermont, or trying to bring back the Pony Express out west, for that matter. Heru was sly and he was mean, and I suppose that in a novel that would preclude any good qualities at all. But sometimes when a man has spent a life being distrusted and distrustful, being a loner or a loser, both by choice and by reason of society's opinions of him, he can find a friend or a lover and simply live for that person, the way a dog lives for its master. And that's the way it seems to have been between Heru and Hartwell. Anyway, there were 4 of them who spent the night in that Brentwood Arms Hotel, which was called the Floating Dog by the lumbermen. The reason why is lost in obscurity, as defunct as the hotel itself. 4 checked in, none checked out. One of them, Andy Desleeps, or Andy Deslecips, was never seen again. For all history tells, he might have spent the rest of the night the rest of his life living in pleasant ease in Portsmouth, but somehow I doubt it. 2 of the other ringleaders, Amsel Bickford and Davy Hartwell himself, were found floating face down in the Kenduskeag. Bickford was missing his head. Someone had taken it off with the swipe of a woodsman's two-hander. Both of Hartwell's legs were gone, and those who found him swore that they had never seen such an expression of pain and horror on a human face. Something had distended his mouth, stuffing out his cheeks, and when his discoverers turned him over and spread his lips, 7 of his toes fell out onto the mud. Some thought he might have lost the other 3 during his years working in the woods. Others held the opinion that he might have swallowed them before he died. Pinned to the back of each man's shirt was a paper with the word Union on it. Claude Heru was never brought to trial for what happened in the Silver Dollar on the night of September 9th, 1905. So there's no way of knowing exactly how he escaped the fate of the others that night in May. We could make assumptions. He had been on his own a long time, had learned how to jump fast, had perhaps developed the knack some cur dogs have of getting out just before real trouble develops. But why didn't he take Hartwell with him? Or was he perhaps taken into the woods with the rest of the agitators? Maybe they were saving him for last, and he was able to get away, even while Hartwell's screams, which have grown muffled as they jammed his toes into his mouth, were echoing in the dark and scaring birds off their roosts. There's no way of knowing, not for sure. But that last feels right to my heart. Claude Heru became a ghost man. He would come strolling into a camp in the St. John's Valley, line up at the cook shed with the rest of the loggers, get a bowl of stew, eat it, and be gone before anyone realized he wasn't one of the Topping gang. Weeks after that, he'd show up in a Winterport beer joint, talking Union and swearing he'd have his revenge on the men that murdered his friends. Hamilton Tracker, William Mueller, and Richard Bowie were the names he mentioned most frequently. All of them lived in Derry, and their gabled, gambreled, cupolaed houses stand on West Broadway to this day. Years later, they and their descendants would fire the black spot. That there were people who would have liked Claude Heroux put out of the way cannot be doubted, particularly after the fire started in June of that year. But although Heroux was seen frequently, he was quick and had an animal's awareness of danger. So far as I have been able to find out, no official warrant was ever sworn out against him, and the police never took a hand. Maybe there were fears about what Heroux might say if he was brought to trial for arson. Whatever the reasons, the woods around Derry and Haven burned all that hot summer. Children disappeared. There were more fights and murders than usual, and a pall of fear as real as the smoke you could smell from the top of Up Mile Hill lay over the town. Narrator's note, if you haven't read Stephen King's It, every 27 years, things in the town of Derry get extra violent, and kids go missing. The rains finally came on September 1st, and it rained for a solid week. Downtown Derry was flooded out, which is not unusual, but the big houses on West Broadway were high above downtown. And in some of those big houses, there must have been sighs of relief. Let the crazy Canuck hide out in the woods all winter, if that's what he wants, they might have said. His work's done for this summer, and we'll get him before the roots dry next June. Then came September 9th. I cannot explain what happened. Thorogood cannot explain it. So far as I know, no one can. I can only relate the events which occurred. The sleepy silver dollar was full of loggers drinking beer. Outside, it was drawing down toward misty dark. The Kundusky was high and silver sullen, filling its channel from bank to bank. And according to Egbert Thorogood, a fallish wind was blowing, the kind that allus find the hole in ye pants and blow straight up the crack of your ass. Your ass. The streets were quagmires. There was a card game going on at one of the tables in the back of the room. They were William Mueller's men. Mueller was part owner of the GS and WM rail line, as well as a lumber potentate who owned millions of acres of prime timber. And the men who were playing poker in the dollar that night were part-time lumbermen, part-time railroad bulls, and full-time trouble. Two of them, Tinker McCutcheon and Floyd Calderwood, had done jail time. With them were Lathrop Rounds. His nickname, as obscure as the Floating Dog Hotel, was El Katook. David Stugly Grenier and Eddie King, a bearded man whose spectacles were almost as fat as his gut. It seemed likely that they were at least some of the men who had spent the last 2.5 months keeping an eye out for Claude Heroux. It seems just as likely, although there's not a shred of proof, that they were in on that little cutting party in May when Hartwell and Bickford were laid low. The bar was crowded, Thorogood said. Dozens of men were bellied up there, drinking beer, eating bar lunches, and dipping onto the sawdust-covered dirt floor. Excuse me, dripping, not dipping. The door opened, and in came Claude Heroux. He had a woodsman's double-bitted axe in his hand. He stepped up to the bar and elbowed himself a place. Egbert Thorogood was standing on his left, and he said that Heroux smelled like a polecat stew. The barman brought Heroux a schooner of beer, 2 hard-cooked eggs in a bowl, and a shaker of salt. Heroux paid him with a $2 bill and put his change, $1.85, into one of the flap pockets of his lumberman's jacket. He salted his eggs and ate them. He salted his beer, drank it off, and uttered a belch. Something's about to happen. I'm going to take a break before it does.
You know what kids love? Monsters. I'm Gorgonzola, one of the new monster vitamins. We come in a haunted house, 7 of us.
I'm Screaming Mimi.
I'm Squeaky.
I'm the blob.
We're delicious. Mom, we think children should get vitamins by eating right, but when they don't, monsters can help. New Monster Vitamins and Monster Vitamins with iron. Look for the haunted house in your favorite store.
I'm Alice Cooper. This is my house. This is Halloween. This is Headbangers Ball. And this is my first trick-or-treater of the night, Dave Mustaine. Dave, what's the most shocking thing that's ever happened to you?
Well, last year, you put me in the electric chair for Halloween. This year, I got a straitjacket on. What next, the guillotine?
The guillotine. There's a few tricks and some musical treats coming up. Right now, here's Quiet Riot. Mental health. Looks good on you, Dave.
When you see the film of mental service, you can see a quarter something special come on after MTV. We brighten up your picture and we send you on your way. So don't forget to turn to us, MTV today.
Fine, but you can't fry an egg on it. Now there's the new Elvira t-shirt. It does everything an ordinary t-shirt does and more. It slices, dices, removes warts, and makes everyone's favorite French fries. But that's not all. It also opens cans, waters your plants while you're away, and scrambles eggs in the shell. How much would you pay for a t-shirt that does all that? Well, don't answer, because the Elvira t-shirt is also a steamer, a washer, a dryer, and a smokeless ashtray. It's a friend, lover, pet, home, shelter, and a pockets fisherman. Yes, it's all this and more. Here's how to order. Send $8.50 to Elvira T-shirt, Post Office Box 38246, Los Angeles, California, 90038. Send $8.50 to Elvira T-shirt, Post Office Box 38246, Los Angeles, California, 90038. The all-new Elvira T-shirt. It's more than just a T-shirt. It's a way of life.
Some days, everything you touch turns to trouble. That's the time to live a little at Dairy Queen. It's the swingingest place in town, with the zingingest malts and shakes. So get on the track if life's a drag, or you're feeling run down. Live a little at Dairy Queen. It's the place to congregate, and the shakes have flavor that just won't wait. So when you're feeling kind of pressed and things look pretty black, put some bang in your life and live a little at Dairy Queen. Share a shake with your friends. They'll all be there, because it's the place that swings. Live a little at Dairy Queen.
Woo! Hey, Jason Bateman. Talk to me a bit. Wait, there. Hey, everybody. I'm reading to Jason Bateman, who's promoting Teen Wolf 2. Right. Here we go. More room out than there is in, Claude, Thorogood said, just as if half the enforcers in northern Maine hadn't been on the prod for Haru all that summer. You know that's the truth, Haru said, except being a Canuck, what he probably said came out sounding more like, you know dat the truth. He ordered himself another schooner, drank it up, and belched again. Talk at the bar went on. Several people called to Claude, and Claude nodded and waved, but he didn't smile. Thorogood said he looked like a man who was half in a dream. At the table in back, the poker game went on. El Katuk was dealing. No one bothered to tell any of the players that Claude Haru was in the bar, although since their table was no more than 20 feet away, and since Claude's name was hollered more than once by the people who knew him, it is hard to know how they could have gone on playing unaware of his potentially murderous presence. But that is what occurred. Again, something that might get clearer to the rest of you if you do read the rest of Stephen King's It. But I should say that I'm only reading parts of this book that aren't going to contain spoilers. So, as if you haven't already heard what happens in this. After he finished his second schooner of beer, Haru excused himself to Thorogood, picked up his two-hander, and went back to the table where Mueller's men were playing five-card stud. Then he started cutting. Floyd Calderwood had just poured himself a glass of rye whiskey and was setting the bottle back down when Haru arrived and chopped Calderwood's hand off at the wrist. Calderwood looked at his hand and screamed. It was still holding the bottle, but all of a sudden wasn't attached to anything but wet gristle and trailing veins. For a moment, the severed hand clutched the bottle even tighter. And then it fell off and lay on the table like a dead spider. Blood spouted from his wrist. At the bar, somebody called for more beer, and someone else asked the bartender, whose name was Jonesy, if he was still dyeing his hair. Never dyed it, Jonesy said in an ill-tempered way. He was vain of his hair. Met a whore down at Ma Courtney's who said what grows around your pecker is just as white as snow, the fellow said. She was a liar, Jonesy replied. Drop your pants, let's us see, said a lumberman named Falkland, with whom Egbert Thorogood had been matching for drinks when Haru came in. This provoked general laughter. Behind them, Floyd Calderwood was shrieking. A few of the men leaning against the bar took a casual look around in time to see Claude Haru bury his woodsman's axe in Tinker McCutcheon's head. Tinker was a big man with a black beard going gray. He got halfway up, blood pouring down his face, then sat down again. Haru pulled the axe out of his head. Tinker started to get up again, and Haru slung the axe down sideways, burying it in his back. It made a sound, Thorogood said, like a load of laundry being dropped on a rug. Tinker flopped over the table, his cards spraying out of his hand. The other players were hollering and bellowing. Calderwood, still shrieking, was trying to pick up his right hand with his left as his life's blood ran out of his stump of a wrist in a steady stream. Stugly Grenier had what Thorogood called a clutch pistol, meaning a gun in a shoulder holster, and he was grabbing for it with no success whatsoever. Eddie King tried to get up and fell right out of his chair on his back. Before he ever could get up, Haru was standing astride him, the axe slung up over his head. King screamed, and he held up both hands in a warding off gesture. Please, Claude, I just married last month, King screamed. The axe came down, its head almost disappearing in King's ample gut. Blood sprayed all the way up to the dollars-beamed roof. Eddie began to crawfish on the floor. Claude pulled the axe out of him the way a good woodsman will pull his axe out of a softwood tree, rocking it back and forth to loosen the clinging grip of the sappy wood. When it was free, he slung it up over his head. He brought it down again, and Eddie King stopped screaming. Claude Haru wasn't done with him, however. He began to chop King up like kindling wood. At the bar, conversation had turned to what sort of winter lay ahead. Vernon Staunchfield, a farmer from Palmyra, claimed it would be a mild one. Fall rain uses up winter snow, was his scripture. Alfie Nogler, who had a farm out on Nogler Road in Derry, it is gone now, where Alfie Ogner once grew his peas and beans and beets. The interstate extension now runs 8.8 mile on a 6-lane course. Beg to disagree. Alfie claimed the coming winter was going to be a geezer. He had seen as many as 8 rings on some of the mohair caterpillars. He said, an unheard of number. Another man held out for ice, another for mud. The blizzard of '01 was duly recalled. Jonesy sent schooners of beer and bowls of hard-cooked eggs skidding down the bar. Behind them, the screaming went on, and the blood flowed in rivers. At this point in my questioning of Egbert Thorogood, I turned off my cassette recorder and asked him, how did it happen? Are you saying you didn't know what was going on? Or that you knew, but you let it go on? Or just what? Thorogood's chin sank down to the top button of his food-spotted vest. His eyebrows drew together. The silence in Thorogood's room, small, cramped, and medicinal-smelling, spun out so long that I was about to repeat my question when he replied, "We knew. But it didn't seem to matter. It was like politics, in a way. Like that. Like town business. Best let people who understand politics take care of that. And people who understand town business take care of that. Such things be best done if working men don't mix in." Are you really talking about fate? And just afraid to come out and say so? I asked suddenly. The question was simply jerked out of me, and I certainly did not expect Thorogood, who was old and slow and unlettered, to answer it. But he did, with no surprise at all. He said. Mayhap I am. While the men at the bar went on talking about the weather, Claude Haru went on cutting. Stugly Grenier had finally managed to clear his clutch pistol. The axe was descending for another chop at Eddie King. who was by then in pieces. The bullet Grenier fired struck the head of the axe and ricocheted off with a spark and a whine. El Katuk got to his feet and started backing away. He was still holding the deck he had been dealing from. Cards were fluttering off the bottom and onto the floor. Claude came after him. El Katuk held out his hands. Stugly Grenier got off another round, which didn't come within 10 feet of Haru. "Stop, Claude," El Katuk said. Thurgood said it appeared like Katuk was trying to smile. "I wasn't with him. I didn't mix in it at all." Haru only growled. "I was in Millinocket," El Katuk said, his voice starting to rise toward a scream. "I was in Millinocket. I swear on my mother's name. Ask anybody if you don't believe me." Claude raised the dripping axe, and El Katuk sprayed the rest of the cards into his face. The axe came down, whistling. El Katuk ducked. The axe head buried itself in the planking that formed the silver dollar's back wall. El Katuk tried to run. Claude hauled the axe out of the wall and poked it between his ankles. El Katuk went sprawling. Stugly Grenier shot at Haru again, this time having a bit more luck. He had been aiming at the crazed lumberjack's head. The bullet struck home in the fleshy part of Haru's thigh. Meantime, El Katuk was crawling busily toward the door with his hair hanging in his face. Haru swung the axe again, snarling and gibbering, and a moment later, Katuk's severed head was rolling across the sawdust-strewn floor. The tongue popped bizarrely out between the teeth. It rolled to a stop by the booted foot of a lumberman named Varney, who had spent most of the day in the Dollar, and who by then was so exquisitely slopped that he didn't know if he was on land or at sea. He kicked the head away without looking down to see what it was, and hollered for Jonesy to run him down another beer. El Katuk crawled another 3 feet, blood spraying from his neck in a high-tension jet, before he realized he was dead and collapsed. That left Stugly. Haru turned on him, but Stugly had run into the outhouse and locked the door. Haru chopped his way in, hollering and blabbering and raving, slobber falling from his jaws. When he got in, Stugly was gone, although the cold, leaky little room was windowless. Haru stood there for a moment, head lowered, powerful arms slimed and spattered with blood, and then, with a roar, he flipped up the lid of the 3-holer. He was just in time to see Stugly's boots disappearing under the ragged board skirting of the outhouse wall. Stugly Grenier ran screaming down Exchange Street in the rain, be-shitted from top to toe, crying that he was being murdered. He survived the cutting party in the Silver Dollar. He was the only one who did. But after 3 months of listening to jokes about his method of escape, he quitted Dairy Area forever. Haru stepped out of the toilet and stood in front of it like a bull after a charge, head down, his axe held in front of him. He was puffing and blowing and covered with gore from head to foot. "Shut the door, Claude. That shitpot stinks to high heaven," Thurgood said. Claude dropped his axe on the floor and did as he had been asked. He walked over to the card-strewn table where his victims had been sitting, kicking one of Eddie King's severed legs out of the way. Then he simply sat down and put his head in his arms. The drinking and conversation at the bar went on. 5 minutes later, more men began to pile in, 3 or 4 sheriff's deputies among them. The one in charge was Lal Machen's father, and when he saw the mess, he had a heart attack and had to be taken away to Dr. Schratt's office. Claude Haru was led away. He was docile when they took him, more asleep than awake. That night, the bars all up and down Exchange and Baker Streets boomed and hollered with news of the slaughter. A righteous, drunken sort of fury began to build up, and when the bars closed, better than 70 men headed downtown toward the jail and courthouse. They had torches and lanterns. Some were carrying guns. Some had axes. Some had peaveys. The county sheriff wasn't due from Bangor until the noon stage the next day, so he wasn't there, and Goose Machen was laid up in Dr. Schratt's infirmary with his heart attack. The 2 deputies who were sitting in the office playing cribbage heard the mob coming and got out of there fast. The drunks broke in and dragged Claude Haru out of his cell. He didn't protest much. He seemed dazed, vacant. They carried him on their shoulders like a football hero. Down to Canal Street they carried him. And there they lynched him from an old elm that overhung the canal. He was so far gone that he didn't kick but twice, Egbert Thurgood said. It was, so far as the town records show, the only lynching to ever take place in this part of Maine. And almost needless to say, it was not reported in the Dairy News. Many of those who had gone on drinking unconcernedly while Haru went about his business in the Silver Dollar were in the necktie party that strung him up. By midnight, their mood had changed. I asked Thorogood my final question. Had he seen anyone he didn't know during that day's violence? Someone who struck him as out of place, strange, funny, even clownish? Someone who would have been drinking at the bar that afternoon. Someone who had maybe turned into one of the rabble-rousers that night as the drinking went on and the talk turned to lynching. Mayhap there was, Thorogood replied. He was tired by then, drooping, ready for his afternoon nap. It were a long time ago, mister. Long and long. But you remember something, I said. I remember thinking that there must be a county fair up in Bangor Way, Thorogood said. I was having a beer in the Bloody Bucket that night. The bucket was about 6 doors from the Silver Dollar. There was a fella in there, comical sort of fella, doing flips and rollovers, juggling glasses, tricks. Put 4 dimes on his forehead, and they'd stay right there. Comical, you know. His bony chin had sunk to his chest again. He was going to sleep right in front of me. Spittle began to bubble at the corners of his mouth, which had as many tucks and wrinkles as a lady's change purse. Seen him a few now and then since, Thorogood said. Figure maybe he had such a good time that night that he decided to stick around. Yeah, he's been around a long time, I said. His only response was a weak snore. Thorogood had gone to sleep in his chair by the window, with his medicines and nostrums lined up beside him on the sill, soldiers of old age at muster. I turned off my tape recorder and just sat looking at him for a moment. This strange time traveler from the year 1890 or so, who remembered when there were no cars, no electric lights, no airplanes, no state of Arizona. Pennywise had been there, guiding them down the path toward another gaudy sacrifice. Just one more in Derry's long history of gaudy sacrifices. That one, in September of 1905, ushered in a heightened period of terror that would include the Eastertide explosion of the Kitchener Ironworks the following year. This raises some interesting and, for all I know, vitally important questions. What does it really eat, for instance? I know that some of the children have been partially eaten. They show bite marks, at least. But perhaps it is we who drive it to do that. Certainly, we have all been taught since earliest childhood that what the monster does when it catches you in the deep wood is eat you. That is perhaps the worst thing we can conceive. But it's really faith that monsters live on, isn't it? I am led irresistibly to this conclusion. Food may be life, but the source of power is faith, not food. And who is more capable of a total act of faith than a child? But there's a problem. Kids grow up. In the church, power is perpetuated and renewed by periodic ritualistic acts. In Derry, power seems to be perpetuated and renewed by periodic ritualistic acts, too. Can it be that it protects itself by the simple fact that, as the children grow into adults, they become either incapable of faith or crippled by a sort of spiritual and imaginative arthritis? Yes. I think that's the secret here. And if I make the calls, how much will they remember? And how much will they believe? Even to end this horror once and for all, or only enough to get them killed? They are being called. I know that much. Each murder in the news cycle has been a call. We almost killed it twice. And in the end, we drove it deep in its warren of tunnels and stinking rooms under the city. But I think it knows another secret. Although it may be immortal, or almost so, we are not. It had only to wait until the act of faith, which made us potential monster killers, as well as sources of power, had become impossible. 27 years, perhaps a period of sleep for it, as short and refreshing as an afternoon nap would be for us. And when it awakes, it is the same, but a third of our lives has gone by. Our perspectives have narrowed. Our faith in magic, which makes magic possible, has worn off like the shine on a new pair of shoes after a hard day's walking. Why call us back? Why not just let us die? Because we nearly killed it. Because we frightened it, I think. Because it wants revenge. And now that we no longer believe in Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, Hansel and Gretel, or the troll under the bridge, it is ready for us. Come on back, it says. Come on back. Let's finish our business in Derry. Bring your jacks and your marbles and your yo-yos. We'll play. Come on back and we'll see if you remember the simplest thing of all. How it is to be children, secure in belief and thus afraid of the dark. On that one, at least, I score 1,000%. I am frightened. So goddamn frightened.
You like that?
Awesome scene there.
Thank you.
Transformation.
Yeah, it's the ear and the forehead.
Did you have to go through any kind of method acting to get through that transformation?
No. As a matter of fact, I didn't.
You don't have to do anything.
Okay, boys, play something a little peaceful for Mr. Lynde.
Up to the local flair. You've never seen a show like this? It's the year's great entertainment event. Don't miss it. Plan to attend Seattle's greatest Halloween show. Oh, nope, I wanted that. That's the spot I wanted. There we go. There it is. Lovely. Now, all right, we've done Stephen King and Paul Lynde and Jason Bateman and Alice Cooper and Dave Mustaine. Let's get into a little bit of whoop. Nope, didn't mean to do that. That sucks. That's not what I wanted to do. Nope. All right, there it goes again. Hey, look, that's the thing I was going to do. I should do this more than once a year, so this is not so awkward. Let's see. Now, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Found among the papers of the late Dietrich Knickerbocker. Starts with a quote, "A passing land of drowsy head it was, of dreams that wave before the half-shut sky, and of gay castles in the clouds that pass, forever flushing round a summer sky. Castle of Indolence." In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at the broad expansion of the river dominated by the ancient Dutch navigators of Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas, when they crossed, there lies a small market town or rural port, by which some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. The name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it, for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather lap of land, among the high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. I recollect that when a stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in the grove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I wandered into it at noontime, when all nature is peculiarly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun, as it broke the Sabbath stillness around and was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for a retreat whither I might steal from the world and its distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. And its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs and subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights, and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene in her gambols. Any fans of Stephen King's It noticing a parallel theme here, maybe? The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air is the apparition of a figure on horseback, without a head. It is said to be, by some, the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. Not that it's relevant necessarily to the story, but a Hessian was a hired German soldier that fought on behalf of the British. They were quite ruthless and efficient and earned their money, but extra despised by the Americans. And who is ever and anon seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of night, as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning this specter, allege that the body of the trooper has been, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in a nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow like a midnight blast is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows. And the specter is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered the sleepy region, they are sure in a little time to inhale the witching influence of the air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there, embosomed in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor, or slowly revolving in their mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In this byplace of nature, there abode, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy wight in the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or, as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as for the forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and country schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from the cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, constructed rudely of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was most ingeniously secured at vacant hours by a withe twisted in the handle of the door. I don't know what that is. Someone please look that up and call me. And stakes set against the window shutters, so that though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would find some embarrassment in getting out. An idea most probably borrowed by the architect, Joost van Houten, from the mystery of an eel pot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill with a brook running close by, and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices, conning over their lessons, might be heard in a drowsy summer's day like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master, in the tone of menace or command, or, peradventure, by the appalling sound of the birch as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore the mind of the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. I would not have imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel potentates of the school who joy in the smart of their subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Your mere puny stripling that winced at the least flourish of the rod was passed by with indulgence, but the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some little tough, wrong-headed, and broad-skirted Dutch urchin who sulked and swelled and drew dogged and sullen beneath the birch, all as he called doing his duty by their parents, and he never inflicted a chastisement without following it by the assurance so consolatory to the smarting urchin that he would remember it and thank him for it the longest day he had to live. When the school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones home who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small, and would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and, although lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. But to help out his maintenance, he was, according to country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers, whose children he instructed. With those he lived successively a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood, with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. So it's like that. It's like when we had to put something in the Constitution that said we don't have to like house soldiers from England anymore. Evidently, it was still practiced to, house schoolmasters. We do it for the nice people. And that makes sense. That's very nice. Internship almost, although you're a fully paid adult. That all this might not be too onerous on the purses of his rustic patrons, who are apt to consider the costs of schooling a grievous burden, and schoolmasters as mere drones, he had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labors of their farms, helped to make hay, mend fences, took horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, and cut wood for the winter fire. He laid aside, too, all the dominant dignity and absolute sway which he lorded it in his little empire, the school, and became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, and like the lion bold, which Wilhelm so magnanimously the lamb did hold, he would sit with a child on one knee and rock a cradle with his foot for whole hours together. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folks in psalmody. First time I read that word, Psalmody. It was a matter of no little vanity to him on Sundays to take his station in the front of the church gallery, with a band of chosen singers, where, in his own mind, he completely carried away the palm from the parson. Certain it is, his voice resounded far above all the rest of the congregation, and there are peculiar quavers still to be heard in that church. And which may be heard half a mile off, quite to the opposite side of the mill pond, on a still Sunday morning, which are said to be legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by divers little makeshifts, in that ingenious way, which is commonly denominated by hook and by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought by all who understood nothing of the labor of head work to have a wonderfully easy life of it. Pausing for a second. Just checking for any alarmed messages of anyone telling me that the stream has dropped out. All right, we're still going. Cool. Let's see. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson. His appearance, therefore, is apt to occasion some little stir at the tea table of a farmhouse, and the addition of a supernumerary dish of cakes or sweetmeats, or, peradventure, the parade of a silver teapot. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. How he would figure among them in the churchyard between services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them in the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement on all the epitaphs of the tombstones, or sauntering, with a whole bevy of them, along the banks of the adjacent mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address. From his half-iterant life, also, he was a kind of traveling gazette carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition. He had read several books, quite thorough, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he most firmly and potently believed. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover bordering the little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales, until the gathering of dust of evening made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature at that witching hour fluttered his excited imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill from the hillside, the boding cry of the tree-toad, the harbinger of storm, the dreary hooting of the screech owl, or the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds, frightened from their roost. The fireflies, too, which sparkled most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him, as one of the uncommon brightness would stream across his path, and if by chance a huge blockhead of a beetle came winging his blundering flight against him, the poor varlet was ready to give up the ghost with the idea he was struck with a witch's token. His only resource on such occasions, either to drown a drowned thought or drive away evil spirits, was to sing solemn tunes. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his nasal melody, in linked sweetness long drawn out, floating from the distant hill or along the dusky road. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives, as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and sputtering along the hearth, and listened to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields, and haunted brooks, and haunted bridges, and haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman, or galloping Hessian of the hollow, as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally by his anecdotes of witchcraft and the direful omens and portentous sights and sounds in the air, which prevailed in the earlier times of Connecticut, and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and with the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn around, and that they were half the time topsy-turvy. But if there was a pleasure in all this, while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber that was all of a ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, and where, of course, no specter dared to show its face, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night! With what wistful look did he eye every trembling ray of light streaming across the waste fields from some distant window! How often was he appalled by some shrub covered with snow, which, like a sheeted spectre, beset his very path! How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder, lest he should become some uncouth being tramping close behind him! Did I say that right? Lest he should behold, or did I say lest he should become? I apologize. Should we behold some uncouth being? And how often was he thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast, howling among the trees, in the idea that it was the galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness. And though he had seen many specters in his time, and had been more than once beset by Satan in diverse shapes. In his lonely perambulations, yet daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in despite of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to a mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening in each week to receive his instructions in psalmody was Katrina van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of a fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed, not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. She was, withal, a little of a coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, and most suited to set off her charms. She wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold, which her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Saardam. I don't know if that's how I pronounce it. Saardam. The tempting stomacher of the olden time, and withal a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country round. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, sent either of his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it, and he piqued himself upon the hearty abundance rather than the style in which he lived. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, and in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled up a spring of the softest and sweetest water in a little well formed of a barrel, and then stole sparkling away through the grass to a neighboring brook that babbled among alders and dwarf willows. Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn that might have served for a church, every window and crevice of which seemed to be bursting forth with the treasures of the farm. The flail was busily resounding within it from morning to night. Swallows and martins skimmed twittering about the eaves, and the rows of the pigeons, some with one eye turned up as if watching the weather, some with their heads under their wings or buried in their bosoms, and others swelling and cooing and bowing about their dames, were enjoyed the sunshine of the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers were grunting in the repose and abundance of their pens, from whence sailed forth, now and then, troops of sucking pigs, as if to snuff the air. A stately squadron of snowy geese were riding in an adjoining pond, convoying whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling through the farmyard, and guinea fowls fretting about it like ill-tempered housewives with their peevish, discontented cry. Before the barn door strutted the gallant cock, that pattern of a husband, a warrior and fine gentleman, clapping his burnished wings and crowing in the pride of gladness of his heart, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, and then generously calling his ever hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel which he had discovered. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes, like snug married couples, with a decent competency of onion sauce. And the porkers he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy, relishing ham. Not a turkey, but he beheld daintily trussed up, with its gizzard under its wing, and peradventure a necklace of savory sausages. And even bright Chanticleer himself lay sprawling on his back in a side dish with uplifted claws, as if craving that quarter which his chivalrous spirit disdained to ask while living. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, and as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadow lands and the rich fields of wheat, rye, buckwheat, Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit which surrounded the warm tenant of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains. And his imagination expanded with the idea how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land and shingle palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes, and presenting to him the blooming Katerina, with a whole family of children, mounted on top of a wagon loaded with household trumpery, with pots and kettles dangling beneath. And he beheld himself bestriding a pacing mare, with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. Oh, my guitar's too far away. I was going to start singing a Buck Owens song. And you can reach me in Alabama, Louisiana, maybe in Tennessee, Indiana, or Montana, or even Missouri, North Dakota. Okay, sorry. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with high-ridged but lowly sloping roofs, built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers, the low, projecting eaves forming a piazza along the front, capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under this were hung flails, harness, various utensils of husbandry, and nets for fishing in the neighboring river. Benches were built along the sides for summer use, and a great spinning wheel at one end, and a churn at the other, showed the various uses to which this important porch might be devoted. From this piazza, the wandering Ichabod entered the hall, which formed the center of the mansion, and the palace, place of usual residence. Here rows of resplendent pewter, ranged on a long dresser, dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool, ready to be spun. In another, a quantity of linsey woolsey from the loom, ears of Indian corn, and strings of dried apples and peaches, hung in gay festoons upon the walls, mingled with the god of red peppers. And a door left ajar gave him a peep into the best parlor, where the claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors. Andirons and their accompanying shovel and tongs glistened from the covert of asparagus tops, mock oranges, and conch shells decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various colored birds' eggs were suspended above it. A great ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room, and a corner cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In his enterprise, however, he had more real difficulties than generally fell to the lot of a knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such like easily conquered adversaries to contend with, and had to make his way merely through gates of iron and brass and walls of adamant to the castle keep where the lady of his heart was confined, all which he achieved as easily as a man would carve his way to the center of a Christmas pie. And then the lady gave him her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the lady, to the heart of a country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices, which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments. And he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries, of real flesh and blood, and the numerous rustic admirers who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in the common cause against any new competitor. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade, the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom van Brunt, the hero of the country round, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame, the great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar. He was foremost at all races and cockfights. With the ascendancy which bodily strength always acquires in rustic life, was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side, and giving his decisions with an air and tone that admitted of no gainsay or appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but had more mischief than ill will in his composition. And with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at bottom. He had 3 or 4 boon companions who regarded him as their model, and at the head of whom he scoured the country, attending every scene of feud or merriment for miles around. In cold weather, he was distinguished by a fur cap surmounted by a flaunting fox's tail, surmounted with a flaunting fox's tail, and when folks at a country gathering descried this well-known crest at a distance, whisking about among a squad of hard riders, they always stood by for a squall. Sometimes his crew would be heard dashing along past the farmhouses at midnight, with whoop and halloo, like a troop of Don Cossacks. And the old dames, startled out of their sleep, would listen for a moment till the hurry-scurry had clattered by, and then exclaim, "Aye, there goes Brom Bones and his gang." The neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill, and when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This rent-pull hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries. And though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire, who felt no inclination to cross a lion in his amours, insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's paling on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting, or, as it is termed, sparking, within all other suitors, sparking within, pause, all other suitors passed by in despair and carried the war into other quarters. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend, and, considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and spirit like a supple jack, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke. And though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, yet the moment it was away, jerk, he was as erect, carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours, any more than that stormy lover Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits at the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Balt Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better than his pipe. Like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do to attend to her housekeeping and manage her poultry, for, as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the piazza, honest Balt would sit smoking an evening pipe with another, watching the achievements of a little wooden warrior, who, armed with a sword in each hand, was most valiantly fighting the wind in the pinnacle of the barn. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering along in the twilight, that hour so favorable to the lover's eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. Begging your pardon, audience, this is not written by me. Some seem to have but one vulnerable point or door of access, while others have 1,000 avenues, and may be captured in 1,000 different ways. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but still a greater proof of generalship to maintain possession of the latter, for man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown, but he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. Certain it is This was not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones. And from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interests of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the preceptor. Preceptor was a Decepticon in the 80s. Preceptor! No, he was an Autobot. Cover your receptors, Preceptor! It was the microscope you had to send away for if you had enough proofs of purchase. I need these asides every now and then to just rest my voice. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain have carried matters to open warfare and have settled their pretensions to the lady according to the mode of those most concise and simple reasoners, the knights errant of yore, by single combat. But Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. He had overheard a boast of Bones, that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him an opportunity. There was something extremely provoking in this obstinately pacific system. If it left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery in his disposition and to play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival, Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried his hitherto peaceful domains, smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, broke into the schoolhouse at night in spite of its formidable fastenings of withe and window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy. So the poor schoolmaster began to think all the witches in the country held their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in presence of his mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner and introduced it as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way, matters went on for some time, without producing any material effect in the relative situations of the contending powers. A fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in pensive mood, sat enthroned on the lofty stool from whence he usually watched all the concerns of his little literary realm. In his hand he swayed a ferule, that scepter of despotic power. The birch of justice reposed on 3 nails behind the throne, a constant terror to evildoers, while on the desk before him might be seen sundry contraband articles and prohibited weapons, detected upon persons of idle urchins, such as half-munched apples, pop-guns, whirligigs, fly-cages, and whole legions of rampant little paper gamecocks. Apparently, there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for his scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them, with one eye kept upon the master. And a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a Negro in tow cloth jacket and trousers, a round-crowned fragment of a hat, like the cap of Mercury, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-broken colt, which he managed with a rope by way of halter. He came clattering up the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merrymaking or quilting frolic to be held that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's. And having delivered this message with that air of importance and effort at fine language, which a Negro is apt to display on a petty embassies of the kind, he dashed over the brook and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of the importance and hurry of his mission. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late, quiet schoolroom. The scholars were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, and those who were tardy had a smart application now and then in the rear to quicken their speed or help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, and the whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing about the green in joy at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half hour at his toilet. I assume that means washroom, not, sitting upon the throne, brushing and furbishing up his best, and indeed only suit of rusty black. Oh, furbishing up his best and indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a bit of broken-looking glass that hung up in the schoolhouse. Huh. Oh, sorry. I spaced out. I was like, he's combing his hair with his broken glass? No. He's looking in a broken mirror while he combs his hair, that he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciliated. Oh my God, I got to use that word sometime soon. He borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciliated, a choleric old Dutchman of the name Hans van Ripper, who replaced Rob Halford and Judas Priest somewhere around 1992. And thus, gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventures. But it is meet I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some account of the looks and equipments of my hero and his steed. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plow horse that had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with a ewe neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favorite speed of his master's, the choleric Van Ripper, who was a furious rider and had infused, very probably, some of his own spirit into the animal. Old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of his saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand, like a scepter, and as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, for so his scanty strip of forehead might be called, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered out almost to the horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gates of Hans van Ripper, and it was altogether such an apparition as is seldom to be met with in broad daylight. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their own sober brown and yellow, while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frost into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals from the neighboring stubble field. The small birds were taking their farewell banquets. In the fullness of their revelry, they fluttered, chirping and frolicking from bush to bush and tree to tree, capricious from the very profusion and variety around them. There was the honest cock-robin, the favorite game of stripling sportsmen, with its loud, querulous note, and the twittering blackbirds flying in sable clouds, and the golden-winged woodpecker with his crimson crest, his broad black gorget and splendid plumage, and the cedar bird with its red-tipped wings and yellow-tipped tail, and its little Montiero cap of feathers, and the blue jay, that noisy coxcomb, in his gay light blue coat and white underclothes, screaming and chattering, nodding and bobbing and bowing, and pretending to be on good terms with every songster of the grove. This variety of observable birds with different songs must be a New England thing, right? I mean, it also factors greatly into the story of Stephen King's It. So I don't know. I don't think we have. I think we probably have a lot more bored bird watchers over here in the Pacific Northwest with, whatever, 7 different breeds of birds to sort of follow around. Mostly seagulls and geese. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast store of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence on the trees, some gathered into baskets and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press. Farther on he beheld great fields of Indian corn, with its golden ears peeping from their leafy coverts, and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them, turning up their fair round bellies to the sun, and giving ample prospects of the most luxurious of pies. And anon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing the odor of the beehive. And as he beheld them, soft anticipation stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered, and garnished with honey or treacle by the delicate little dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. Thus feeding his mind with many sweet thoughts and sugared suppositions, he journeyed along the sides of a range of hills which looked down upon some of the goodliest scenes of the mighty Hudson. The sun gradually wheeled his broad disk down in the west. The wide bosom of the Tappan Zee lay motionless and glassy, excepting that here and there a gentle undulation waved and prolonged the blue shadow of the distant mountain. A few amber clouds floated in the sky, without a breath of air to move them. The horizon was of a fine golden tint, changing gradually into a pure apple green, and from that into the deep blue of the Midhaven. A slanting ray lingered on the woody crests of the precipices that overhung some parts of the river, giving greater depth to the dark gray and purple of their rocky sides. A sloop was loitering in the distance, dropping slowly down with the tide, her sail hanging uselessly against the mast, and as the reflection of the sky gleamed along the still water, it seemed as if the vessel was suspended in the air. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Heer Van Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country, old farmers, a spare leathern-faced race, in homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings and huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles, their whisk withered little dames, in close-crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun petticoats with scissors and pincushions, and gay calico pockets hanging on the outside. Buxom lasses, almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting where a straw hat, a fine ribbon, or perhaps a white frock gave symptoms of city innovation. The sons in short, square-skirted coats, with rows of stupendous brass buttons, and their hair generally queued in the fashion of the times, especially if they could procure an eelskin for their purpose, it being esteemed throughout the country as a potent nourisher and strengthener of their hair. Sorry, I thought eelskin might have been, a sort of prophylactic of some kind. No, I didn't really, but reading that phrase, come on. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mettle and mischief, and which no one but himself could manage. He was, in fact, noted for preferring vicious animals, given to all kinds of tricks, which kept the rider in constant risk of his neck, for he held a traceable, well-broken horse as unworthy of a lad of spirit. Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion, not those of the bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious display of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea table in the sumptuous time of autumn. Such heaped up platters of cakes of various, almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughty donut, the tender oliekoek, I don't know what that is, K-O-E-K, oliekoek, and the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes and short cakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. And then there were apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef. God damn it, I'm hungry now. And moreover, delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention boiled shad and roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy, pretty much as I have enumerated them, with the motherly teapot sending up its clouds of vapor from the midst. Heaven bless the mark. I want breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, and am too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in so great a hurry as his historian, and did ample justice to every dainty. He was a kind and thankful creature, whose heart dilated in proportion as his skin was filled with good cheer, and whose spirits rose with eating, as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes around him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all this scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Then he thought how soon he'd turn his back upon the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers in the face of Hans von Ripper and every other niggardly patron, and kick any itinerant pedagogue out of doors that should dare to call him comrade. Narrator's note, niggardly means, cheap. Put it that way. Old Baltus Van Tassel moved about his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor. Round and jolly as the harvest moon, his hospitable attentions were brief, but expressive, being confined to the shake of a hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. And now the sound of the music from the common room or hall summoned to the dance. The musician was an old gray-headed Negro who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was old and battered as himself. The greater part of it time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with a motion of the head, bowing almost to the ground, and stamping with his foot whenever a fresh couple were to start. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle, and to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion, clattering about the room, you would have thought St. Vitus himself had blessed, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. He was the admiration of all the Negroes who, having gathered of all ages and sizes from the farm in the neighborhood, stood forming a pyramid of shining black faces at every door and window, gazing with delight at the scene, rolling their white eyeballs, and showing grinning rows of ivory from ear to ear. How could the flogger of the urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all his amorous oglings was Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. No, while Brom Bones, not was Brom Bones, excuse me. While the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folks who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. This neighborhood, at the time of which I am speaking, was one of those highly favored places about which abound with the chronicle and great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war. It had, therefore, been the scene of marauding and infested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction, and in the indistinctness of his recollection to make himself the hero of every exploit. There was the story of Dufeu Martling, a large blue-bearded Dutchman who had nearly taken a British frigate with an old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastwork, only that his gun burst at the 6th discharge. And there was an old gentleman, who shall be nameless, being too rich a mynheer to be lightly mentioned, who in the Battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defense, parried a musket ball with a small sword, insomuch that he absolutely felt it whiz round the blade and glance off the hilt, in proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword, with the hilt a little bent. There were several more that had been equally great in the field, not one of whom but was persuaded that he had a considerable hand in bringing the war to a happy termination. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind. Local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our country places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in their graves before the surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintance left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts, except in our long-established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's, and as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about the funeral trains, and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made also of the woman in white, the haunted dark glen at Raven Rock, and was also heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief part of the stories, however, turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late, patrolling the country, and, it was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of this church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll, surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its decent whitewashed walls shine modestly forth, like Christian purity beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water, bordered by high trees, between which peeps may be caught at the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that there at least, the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a wide, woody dell, along which raves a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. Over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was formerly thrown a wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it, even in the daytime, but occasioned by a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. The tale was told of old Brouwer, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, and was obliged to get up behind him, and how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brouwer into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. This story was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper, that he had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch, and should have won it too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, the countenances of all listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep in the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families and their wagons, and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pillions behind their favorite swains, and their light-hearted laughter mingling with the clatter of hooves echoed along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter until they gradually died away, and the late scene of noise and frolic was all silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress. Fully convinced he was now on the high road to success, what passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth after no very great interval, with an air quite desolate and chapfallen. Oh, these women, these women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roost rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of rural wealth on which he had so often gloated, he went straight to the stable and with several hearty cuffs and kicks roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corn and oats and whole valleys of timothy and clover. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homewards along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, and which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him the Tappan Zee spread its dusky, indistinct waste of waters, with here and there the tall mast of a sloop, riding quietly at anchor under the land, in the dead hush of midnight, so he could even hear the barking of the watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson. But it was so vague and faint as only to give an idea of his distance from this faithful companion of man. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock accidentally wakened would sound far off, from some farmhouse away among the hills. But it was like a dreaming sound in his ear. No signs of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night drew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood, and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragical story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by, and was universally known by the name of Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from the tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. As though his whistle was answered, it was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. Sorry, let me reread that. Not as though. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. Excuse me. It was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. And as he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood laid bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon another, as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen. known by the name of Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over the stream. On that side of the road, where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts, matted thick with wild grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured. And under the covert of those chestnuts and vines were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution, gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs. Half a score is what, 10? 10 kicks in the ribs? And attempted to dash briskly across the bridge, but instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked lustily with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, it is true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into the thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel into the starveling, Starveling, ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen and towering. It stirred not, but seemed to gather up in the gloom like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late. And besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice. Still, there was no answer. Once more he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion. With a scramble and a bound, stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might now in some degree be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventurer Brombones with a galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip, but the spectre started full jump with him. Away then, they dashed through the thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body away over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They now had reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon instead of keeping up it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. The road leads Now, this road leads through a sandy hollow shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge famous in Goblin story. And just beyond swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder around the neck, when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment, the terror of Hans von Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and, unskillful rider as he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes the other, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of his horse's backbone with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered to him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of the silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brombone's ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind him to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning the old horse was found without his saddle, and with bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly by about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans von Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt, the tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road, and evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans von Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined the bundle which contained all his worldly effects. They consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 stocks for the neck, a pair of 2 worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog's ears, and a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, and a New England Almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling, in which last was a sheet of foolscap, much scribbled and blotted in several fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in honor of the heiress Van Tassel. These magic books and the poetic scrawl were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans von Ripper, who, from that time forward, determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good come of this same reading and writing. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and he had received his quarter's pay but a day or 2 before, he must have had about his person at the time of disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church and on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. Stories of Brower, of Bones, and a whole budget of others were called to mind, and when they had diligently considered them all and compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head any more about him. The school was removed to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue reigned in his stead. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had left the neighborhood partly through fear of the goblin and Hans Van Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Brombones, too, who, shortly after his rival's disappearance, conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood around the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay. It was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue, and the plowboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. Postscript found written in the hand of Mr. Knickerbocker. Handwriting, not written in the hand. Not a disembodied hand with writing upon it. The preceding tale is given almost in the precise words in which I heard it related at a corporation meeting at the ancient city of Manhattoes, at which were present many of its sagest and most illustrious burghers. The narrator was a pleasant, shabby, gentlemanly old fellow in pepper and salt clothes with a sadly humorous face, and one whom I strongly suspected of being poor. He made such efforts to be entertaining. When his story was concluded, there was much laughter and approbation, particularly from 2 or 3 deputy aldermen, who had been asleep the greater part of the time. There was, however, one tall, dry-looking old gentleman with beetling eyebrows, who maintained a grave and rather severe face throughout, now and then folding his arms, inclining his head, and looking down upon the floor, as if turning a doubt over in his mind. He was one of your wary men, who never laugh but upon good grounds, when they have reason and law on their side. When the mirth of the rest of the company had subsided, and silence was restored, he leaned one arm on the elbow of his chair, and sticking the other akimbo, demanded, with a slight but exceedingly sage motion of the head and contraction of the brow, what was the moral of the story and what it went to prove. The storyteller, who was just putting a glass of wine to his lips as a refreshment after his toils, paused for a moment, looked at his inquirer with an air of infinite deference, and lowering the glass slowly to the table, observed that the story was intended most logically to prove that there is no situation in life but has its advantages and pleasures, provided we will but take a joke as we find it. That, therefore, he that races with the goblin troopers is likely to have a rough riding of it. Ergo, for a country schoolmaster to be refused the hand of a Dutch heiress is a certain step to high preferment in the state. The cautious old gentleman knit his brows tenfold closer after this explanation, being sorely puzzled by the ratiocination of the syllogism, while, methought, the one in pepper and salt eyed him with something of a triumphant leer. At length he observed that all this was very well, but still he thought the story a little on the extravagant. There were 1 or 2 points on which he had his doubts. "Faith, sir," replied the storyteller, "as to that matter, I don't believe one half of it myself." DK. The end. Happy Halloween,